Hey there, everyone, and welcome back. It's Kelly from Kelly's Astrology here. Today, I've got something a little different for you. I want to share some tips and insights about navigating a Saturn transit to the moon in your chart. So I want to talk about some of those themes in general, but I am going to add some specific information in that will help for any of you who have your moon in one of the mutable signs. So the moon in Gemini, in Virgo, in Sagittarius or Pisces. Of course, it is the mutable sign moons that are going to have the Saturn transits over the next few years. So 23, 24, 25, and even the early part of 2026. So I want to break down some of that for you. I'm also going to share a code where you can save 10% off my training classes or webinars on Saturn transits. I have two Saturn transits webinars. One is on Saturn transits through each of the 12 houses. So in that webinar, I give you some insights about if Saturn is transiting your second house, what to expect or what that might look like. And if Saturn is transiting your third and fourth and fifth house. So that is the Saturn transits through the houses webinar. And I also have a separate webinar where I look at Saturn in transit to each of the visible planets. So Saturn transits to the sun or to Mars or Mercury or Saturn and the moon. Of course, I'm going to actually share a lot of the tips about Saturn transits to the moon with you today. But if you want more or you want the full teaching, those two webinars have all the insights you need. And a little bit later in today's video, I'm going to share that code where you can save 10% off. So Saturn transits to the moon. One of the reasons I wanted to talk a little bit about this is a hugely sensitive type of transit. It tends to be the kind of transit that I work a lot with clients in my private practice. So at any point in time, there's always a bunch of us having Saturn transiting our moon. In the last few years, Saturn was moving through the sign of Aquarius. So anybody with the moon in one of the fixed signs, in Taurus, in Leo, in Scorpio, or Aquarius, was having a Saturn transit. So every time Saturn moves into a new sign, there are 4 moon sign placements that start to undergo a Saturn transit. And when Saturn is transiting your moon, your emotions are going to be highlighted. Your sense of support or loneliness is going to be made clear. And you might have to focus more on themes like self-care, on your health, on family or domestic matters. And there's another part of our chart that gets activated, which I'm going to talk you through as well. So Saturn transiting the moon is a call to connect with, honor, and care for your heart. You know, the moon represents the most vulnerable and tender part of ourselves. It talks about our emotional needs and requirements, our physical needs, the needs of our body. And the moon in our chart often sets up a pattern about safety and security. Sometimes we learn how to create safety and security for ourselves early in life, and other times our early life experiences show us how to survive when we have a lack of safety and security. And those themes about security, about safety, even about bonding and attachment, they're all tied to the moon in our chart. And every 7 years, when Saturn comes into one of those dynamic aspects to the moon, we're kind of revisiting to perhaps heal, grow, and reorganize or update how we're caring for ourselves and even what how we might define protection or safety. So what I mean by every 7 years is that it's about every 7 years that Saturn will transit through a sign of the same modality. So for instance, if you're a mutable sign moon, if we go back to 2016, 2017, which was the last time we had Saturn in a mutable sign, even a little bit of 2015, when Saturn was in Sagittarius, 2015, 16, 17, that's the last time most of you with a mutable sign moon had a big Saturn transit. And what I mean by this is that every 7 years, transiting Saturn will either be conjunct, square, or opposite the moon in your chart. So while I'm going to talk about some pretty poignant topics and maybe some tender topics, I did want to just kind of make sure we have that contextual framework that a Saturn moon transit is important. It tends to help us redefine and update some of the necessary essentials in our life, but we are doing this on a fairly regular pattern every 7 years. So that's important to keep in mind. You know, when Saturn transits the moon every 7 years, we get this sort of updated sense of emotional awareness. You might learn what it means to be more responsible for your own feelings and needs, given whatever the circumstances of your life might be. Because if you think back to 2015, 2016, 2017, what your life looked like then versus what your life looks like now is probably really different. Your responsibilities are different. Your needs are different. Your physical body has changed. Your emotional awareness has matured. And so this is a chance to make sure you've got rituals and practices and supports in place that help the needs that you have today in the present, rather than the needs that you might have had 6 or 7 years ago. So you might also get clarity about these kind of core instinctive needs and truths. One thing we forget in a big Saturn transit is that Saturn does bring a huge amount of clarity. Sometimes that's a reality check, that's a little bit of a bitter pill to swallow, but at least we know the truth of what's going on. So when Saturn transits your moon, things that you've sort of been maybe unconsciously tuning into, or like, is that a thing? Saturn transits the moon and you're like, oh, I get it. This is what I need to be working on through the duration of the Saturn moon transit. Okay, so Saturn transits to the moon. Let's talk about some dates and details for Saturn in Pisces to the moon placement in a mutable sign. So Saturn is in Pisces 2023, 2024, 2025, and a part of 2026. It's not there for all of 2025, but it does retrograde back in. So if your moon, this is the degree that your moon is at in the mutable sign, matters in terms of the exact time period that you will have your Saturn moon transit. So if your moon is between 0 and 7 degrees of Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, or Pisces, your Saturn moon transit is going to happen in 2023 and the early part of 2024. If your moon is in a mutable sign between 8 and 19 degrees, or at 8 or 19 degrees, or the space in between, then you will have your Saturn moon transit in 2024 and the early part of 2025. If your moon is in a mutable sign between 20 and 29 degrees, that last third of the mutable sign, your Saturn moon transit isn't kicking in by degree until 2025 and early 2026. So it's important to understand, if you're an early mutable moon placement, you're having that transit 2023, 2024, as soon as Saturn gets into Pisces. If you're in the middle part of the mutable sign, it's sort of in the middle of the Saturn in Pisces transit, which is 2024 and the early part of 2025. And if your moon is in the latter part of a mutable sign, then your Saturn transit will be happening in 2025 and 2026. Of course, you could apply those dates for any other planet or angular placement that you might have at those degrees in a mutable sign, but I'll leave that to you to do on your own and save that for another time. So that Saturn moon transit, that kind of gives you a guideline as to timing. Now, there is a theory in some styles of astrology that the Saturn moon transit, as soon as Saturn comes into the sign that your moon is in, or the sign where it will make the square or the opposition, the themes of the transit begin. And I do think there is some validity in that approach. But I also know that the intensity and the most important or dramatic or major changes of that Saturn moon transit will happen when Saturn is transiting your moon by degree. And that's why I wanted to break down those time periods for you. So if you have the moon in Gemini or in Sagittarius, Saturn in Pisces will be making a square to your moon in Gemini or Sag. If you have the moon in Virgo, Saturn in Pisces, of course, will be opposing that moon in Virgo. And if you have the moon in Pisces, then of course, Saturn in Pisces is going to make a conjunction to that moon of yours. So that is some of our dates and details, just to get the logistics worked out. Timelines are really important in timing with astrology so that we have a good sense of when the most important stuff might be happening. So if you've been, really hopeful about a situation in your life and you see that you're having a Saturn moon transit come up, it's time to get a little bit more pragmatic or practical. Saturn moon transits, they do bring this grounded quality. Yes, even Saturn in Pisces is going to have an anchoring or a solidifying effect. And that can help you focus on the facts of a situation, can help you get that clarity and maybe be a little more honest with yourself or those around you. Is this job or relationship or family situation really meeting my needs? Or am I feeling overburdened by duties or responsibilities that I've kind of outgrown? Sometimes a Saturn moon transit feels a little uncomfortable, or we don't feel super happy in it because we get this sense, we're sort of waking up to the fact that we're in a different place and we want to interact with other people in a different way. And some of the patterns or habits or duties or obligations we've got in our lives are based on the old us, and we need to make those changes. So the Saturn moon transit might see you saying no to loved ones more often. You might be more interested in prioritizing your own care and well-being rather than supporting others. And I know that sounds a little bit selfish, but sometimes we just don't have the energy all the time in a Saturn moon transit to do all the things for all the people. And one thing a Saturn moon transit is really good for is helping you clarify your most core essential priorities. What is necessary for your survival? What is necessary for your well-being? And so these topics about well-being and health are really common to come up under a Saturn moon transit. The moon is one of the main planets in the chart to do with health and the physical body. And a Saturn moon transit can help you tune into the needs of your aging or changing body and be a little bit more responsible for doing what your body needs. And sometimes this means simplifying our eating or lifestyle habits. And sometimes it means being more consistent with movement, activity, or exercise. Now, when Saturn's aspecting the moon, it's not to say you need to take on some extreme eating or exercise plan, but you do want to adopt practices with food and activity that are sustainable, that are life enhancing, and you want to make sure you're ditching any habits that might be detrimental to your health or to your body. So, if you know that you like to eat ice cream, even though you have an allergy to dairy or sugar or something, a Saturn moon transit might kick you in the proverbial rear a little bit and kind of show you why you need to adhere to whatever, wellness protocols are best for your body. So you can't really say this is what everybody in a Saturn moon transit needs to do, but learning more about what your body, the best circumstances, the best conditions for your body to function, to get enough sleep, to be clear-headed, to have energy through the day, to feel vital. That's what a Saturn moon transit can teach you. So you might take on a new commitment about your health and well-being. You might learn about a diet or a lifestyle change that is really going to enhance your well-being and vitality. The moon, even though it's generally about the body and health, it also speaks particularly to food and digestion. So sometimes we're learning about different foods and different eating protocols and figuring out, how to move forward with an eating ritual or practice that is really good for you. So if you have any digestive or food or health symptoms that come up when you're in a Saturn moon transit, they're great things to spend some time and energy exploring, because the clarity of Saturn may be helping you realize something that's really necessary or essential for your long-term well-being. Remember that Saturn transits can require some effort in the short term that promise a payoff in the future. So the Saturn transit, Saturn always has that longer term view. And sometimes we're having to make short term, sacrifices or put the effort in now to get the rewards in the future. So a Saturn moon transit, for instance, can be about recognition of what is going to help your body with aging or getting older and starting to build those practices and habits in now. Okay, so that's part of the Saturn moon transit. I also want to talk briefly about home and family dynamics, because of course the moon represents where we live, our family of origin. It represents our entire emotional well-being, but it does speak specifically to home and family. And so when Saturn comes to aspect your moon, this can be a time where you're really questioning your home situation or your living situation. Is this the right place for me long term? Is it a sustainable situation? Can I afford the rent or the mortgage? Are there necessary maintenance or repairs that need to be taken around the home or the space that you're living in? So with Saturn to the moon, we're thinking about having what we need, but not having excess in our living situation. So sometimes this is about downsizing or consolidating. Depending on the age and stage of life, your Saturn moon transit could be, we want to start having a family and we're going to need more space. So the idea with Saturn moon is thinking about what you're going to need over the next 7 to 10 years from a housing perspective and start making those changes in a way that is sustainable and reasonable. You know, with the Saturn moon, we're a little more cautious and conservative. So we don't want to overextend ourselves financially, but we definitely want to make sure we've got what we need. So major renovations that are to do with necessary repairs and maintenance can be likely. And then in terms of family dynamics, Saturn moon can make us a little bit, put us into a ruminating or almost a little bit of a reflective space where we're thinking back on childhood and our parents and the way we were raised. And to the extent that we have good memories, that can be affirming, even if we're a little bit nostalgic or sad that those times have passed. But if we don't have good memories, sometimes this brings up an old family wound or story that we're ready to process through or heal at a deeper level. Remember, every time we're having a Saturn moon transit, we are getting into a more wise, mature, kind of that elder wisdom zone for ourselves. And as we start to get more of that kind of mature perspective, it does help us review the past and see things in a different light. So sometimes a little bit of melancholy is really normal in a Saturn moon transit. And so you might feel a little bit flat or lower energy compared to how you normally are. And it's really okay to be doing less or to be less available for people, or to acknowledge that maybe you're a bit worn out by patterns, family dynamics that you've always engaged in, and you just don't want to have to work that hard anymore. So it's really okay not to be kind of bubbly, bright, and enthusiastic in a Saturn moon transit. There's a deep process about engaging with wisdom, with self-realization and self-awareness at a much deeper level that is going on when you're in a Saturn moon transit. And you might be ready to make some changes to long-running patterns or habits or tendencies that you've been involved in. Okay, so there's always so much more I can say about a transit. I do have a blog post on this Saturn moon transit, and I'll link to that below, as well as the Saturn webinars. I need to give you the code. So the code to save 10% on those 2 Saturn training webinars, Saturn transit training webinars, is Saturn 10. So that's the word Saturn with the number 10 after it. And I'm going to pop that code in the comments below, because I know with my Aussie accent, sometimes the vowels and things can be tricky to understand. So the final tip, two final points for the Saturn moon transit. Saturn moon really activates the hermit type of archetype. And so you might feel, less sociable, less outgoing when you're in a Saturn moon transit. So that archetype of the hermit, or like a hibernating bear that's a little bit withdrawn and really introspective, can be helpful. Your Saturn moon transit will last for no more than 12 months. Usually it's 6 to 9 months, depending on the exact degree. Sometimes it's only 4 or 6 weeks if, Saturn is only passing through the degree where your moon is once. But typically Saturn will do that retrograde and activate these degrees 3 times. So maybe it's just 6 weeks, maybe it's 6 to 9 months, but it is a reasonably manageable amount of time, if you like. So if we're thinking about that hermit or that hibernation archetype, pulling back, maybe not going to as many things, maybe conserving your energy, maybe you're conserving cash, maybe you're focused on a long-term goal. That means you're not available for short-term fun. These are really appropriate in a Saturn moon transit. Okay, the second piece, so the hermit archetype and sort of resting, pulling back, Saturn moon transits really have the feeling of like a winter energy. So if you think about what you do in the winter time, where you might be at home more, you might be cozy more, you might be reading books or watching movies, you might be just sort of hunkering down a bit. That can be sometimes what we crave when we're in a Saturn moon transit. So the final piece I want to mention is that when you are in a Saturn moon transit, explore the topics of the Cancer house in your chart. So maybe you have Cancer on the 2nd house of money, and that means the moon is your personal income, cash flow, budget, money planet. And with Saturn transiting the moon, some of the areas that you might be making long-term plans or wanting to consolidate around will be to do with your finances, Maybe you have Cancer on the 11th house cusp of friendship, and Saturn transiting your moon is a time where you're going to want to more deeply evaluate the friendships in your life. So even though the moon is generally about like home and family, and sometimes specifically about mother, it can be about other people in your chart, depending on the house that you have Cancer on the cusp of. So do take a little look at where is Cancer in my chart, what house cusp is it on, and how does the moon's management of the topics of the Cancer house factor into the Saturn moon transit that you might be having. And that way you can get a little bit more of the really personalized topics that might be coming up for you in your Saturn moon transit. So thanks for joining me for this video today, everybody. Let me know, have you had a Saturn moon transit that you were kind of aware of while you're in it? I know we've all had a Saturn moon transit. As soon as we're over the age of 7 or 8, everybody's had one. But let me know something about how your most recent Saturn moon transit went. Maybe you have the moon in a fixed sign and you're just coming out of it. Maybe you have the moon in a mutable sign and you're seeing how your Saturn moon transit is going to play out. I love to hear your stories and experiences in the comments below. Also, remember to subscribe to my channel and like this video to make sure you get updates about future videos. And if you are interested in those Saturn transits webinars to go more in terms of Saturn transiting to other planets or Saturn transiting through the houses, make sure you remember that code Saturn10 to save 10% off those courses. Thanks so much again, team, for being here with me today. I will see you soon. Bye for now.